If you understand these words being said right now, that means you speak a language. Congratulations! You're most likely watching this video in English, which means you've had to acclimatize to some of the most atrocious spelling schemes ever devised. Look at the word kernel, or receipt, or asthma. If you really wanted to find out why these spellings are so cursed, you'd have to go back in time, a long, long way back. Fortunately, I happen to have a time machine, so let's go. Humans have seemingly been speaking for as long as there have been humans to speak. We're not sure if every language descends from one spoken by the very first humans and then branched out, or whether they came from a few different roots. And we probably never will, for the simple reason that these cultures didn't write things down. For whatever reason, writing seems to be a much more complex concept than verbal speech. While almost every culture in the world has some means of verbal communication, linguists generally agree on only 4 times that language was independently invented. In Mesopotamia, about 5,300 years ago, in Egypt, about 5,200 years ago, in China, only 3,200 years ago, and in Mesoamerica, a mere 2,500 years ago. That may seem like a long time, but if you compare it to the entire history of all humans to ever live, that means that even if you use the most conservative estimates, humans have had no way to write things down at all for over 99.7% of their history. Despite this, it is actually possible to go very far back and work our way up. We can build language family trees, or evolutionary trees, to see how languages are related to each other. We begin with Indo-European, the very first language spoken by the first groups of humans to arrive in Europe and Asia. From here, the branch splits in twain, with Indo-Iranian diverging away as some humans formed settlements in South Asia, while others migrated up north to Europe, forming the European branch. As people formed their own groups, the European languages diverged further. Some small sprouts appeared off of the big branches, usually in more isolated areas, where the languages didn't have a chance to mingle. These small branches are the home of the Celtic languages, and Albanian, which stands alone on its own branch. Some of the earliest big branches to appear were the Slavic languages, like Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian, which diverged a little before the branch split again, with the love languages like Italian, French, Spanish, and the now deceased Latin appearing closer south, and Germanic ones like German and Dutch going to the north. Some of these Germanic humans went over to this island here. Over hundreds of years, their language diverged into Old English, the very first iteration of the language we speak now. Media often paints Old English and Middle English as a sort of old-timey version of our current language. But actual Old English wasn't just saying thou and thee all the time. It was a completely different language. For example, the sentence I eat bread might be translated to something like ik eet glaf. Some of you might recognize that ik as being similar to the Dutch ik or the German ich. English was much more Germanic in its earlier days. When the Normans made an invasion effort, parts of their language invaded too, turning English into a melting pot of languages, which is part of the reason why it's so awkward. This is not the whole reason though, is it? Because there's still that writing system, where there are multiple sounds to a letter, multiple letters to a sound, and some of the strangest spellings in language. To understand why we use these 26 letters, we need to go 5,200 years back in time and an entire continent away. Our alphabet begins with the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, first cleanly carved from top to bottom in stone, then later written with ink from right to left on papyrus. These symbols were only one step away from mere drawings of what you wanted to represent, and as such, they were very hard to remember, cumbersome to read, and needlessly complex. Basically, no one would ever go to the trouble of writing anything if it wasn't super necessary. After trading with the Egyptians for a bit, some of the people from the Sinai Peninsula adopted the hieroglyphs to use for themselves. They actually improved on the writing system quite a bit. They changed them from symbols for entire words to just symbols for certain sounds. For example, they took this Egyptian hieroglyph for ox, simplified it and called it Aleph, their word for ox, and made it represent the sound A. It's the same story with this Egyptian symbol of a reed hut, which became their word for house, Bet. They transformed a bunch of letters in this way and even threw in a few original symbols of their own. They then passed this script down to the ancient Phoenicians in the Mediterranean, who simplified and altered symbols still more until they started looking like an actual alphabet. The Phoenicians kept most of the names the same, but again threw in a couple original symbols of their own. Interestingly, Phoenician was still written going from right to left. It would take a while for the direction to switch. The Phoenician alphabet ended up with the Greeks, who simplified still further and made some little changes, probably by accidents over hundreds of years of writing. They also changed the names of a lot of the letters to fit their way of speaking. In an attempt to mimic the flowing nature of speech, the Greeks wrote from right to left and left to right, alternating back and forth to make it easier for the eyes to follow. They called this baustropheden, meaning as the ox plows, a little inadvertent reference to the original Aleph. When the Romans became popular, they took the alphabet and modified it a little, also mixing in other elements from other alphabets that also descended from the ancient Phoenician. At this point, the alphabet was basically how it is now, but with one notable exception. Notice that we don't have the letter W or the letter U. Why? Well, the Latins made both of those sounds with this letter, which you would recognize as V. So V was basically a stand-in for both U and W. More on that later. When the English and other Germanic languages got their hands on the alphabet, they stumbled into a problem. English has a lot of sounds, way more sounds than the Latins needed in their alphabet. To amend this, the English borrowed letters from their enemies the Norse and from older Anglo-Saxon scripts to make some new consonants, giving us the letters Thorn, Eth, Win, and Yoch, and rounded that off by making some vowels, by smashing pre-existing vowel letters together, giving us Ash and Ethel. All was well. A clear direction of writing had been established, and English spelling was mostly phonetic, at least more phonetic than it is now, for several hundred years, right up until the printing press came along to ruin it all. The very first printing presses were very bulky and had limited space for letters, and so, in an attempt to make them easier to use and produce, printing press makers cut these letters back out of the alphabet. To fill the hole left by the missing letters, weird spellings were concocted. The and th sounds made by thorn and eth were replaced with th, while win and yoch's W sound became indicated by two letter V's, which also represented U at this time. This double U eventually became its own letter, W. Ash and Ethel were replaced by vowel pairings. By the time the printing press had compacted, the damage was done. Thorn and its companions were dead, and English spellings have never been the same since. Rest in peace, Thorn, Eth, Win, Yoch, Ash, and Ethel. You are sorely missed. This, combined with the countless borrowed words from French and Norse, the low literacy rates and lack of defined spellings, formed the perfect storm for the most cursed conglomerate of weird words anywhere in the world.